Welcome back, AP World. So this is part two of China, and we're continuing from the Xia Dynasty to the Shang Dynasty. So notice the dates of the Shang Dynasty, quite a long one here, right? So well, over 600 years. So one of the first questions I wanted to pose to you to make sure we're still working on AP skills is whether the Shang Dynasty is first or the Xia Dynasty is first. Now, there are many different schools of thought to this. Most history textbooks do not mention the Xia dynasty very much, if at all. So why might that be? Most of it is because of the lack of archaeological evidence that exists from the Xia dynasty, that it happened so long ago, and that subsequent Chinese societies essentially built over the older societies, essentially means that there's a lot of scholarly dispute about whether this dynasty ever existed or whether it was essentially myth, fairy tale. So we can play around with that. I will tell you that all of the Chinese students that I have taught in the past are very steadfast about the existence of the Xia dynasty. They all argue that the dynasty does indeed exist. Other things about the Shang dynasty. So again, at least according to most scholars and historians, it is the first dynasty that existed in China's history. Okay, so again, that's kind of the predominant scholarly theory, but we could challenge it. And again, just as a reminder, a dynasty is a line of rulers who belong to the same family. Essentially, one of the reasons why the Shang dynasty is so much more popular as the first dynasty, so to speak, is because there are extensive written records about the Shang dynasty, and there are not the same kind of records about the Xia dynasty. Rather, there are more archaeological records. We see with the Shang dynasty that there definitely is a theocratic government in place in the sense that all the kings of the Shang dynasty were also high priests. Okay, so kings, in addition to ruling, they would also perform very special ceremonies. So for instance, if there was very good weather or a good harvest, kings would be in control of the celebration regarding that harvest. And also, kings were seen as not immortal per se, but they had the ability to call upon their ancestors who clearly were dead. But the idea was that there was some sort of godly quality to the kings during the Shang dynasty. Oh, just a few more things from this slide. The Shang dynasty is also very well known for its powerful military. The most popular material of choice for weapons at this period was bronze, because we're still in the Bronze Age. This image that you see here on the left is actually a 3,000-year-old chariot that was discovered in a burial tomb in Luoyang, which is in Henan province. The other thing that's very interesting about the Shang dynasty is that they did have a writing system. Actually, a lot of the writing that was discovered from this period is from what are called oracle bones. This is actually the bottom of a turtle shell with very ancient characters engraved on it. So you can deduce a few things from this. First off, that paper or papyrus, or also paper that the Chinese subsequently invented, did not yet exist. So just like the clay tablets that you saw in Sumeria, essentially the Chinese in ancient times worked with the materials that were available to them. And oracle bones clearly are very well preserved. So as far as Shang writing is concerned, you can make a pretty definite comparison to cuneiform, but not so much to the Phoenician writing or the phonetic writing, right? So Shang writing is also pictographic, and every single symbol represents a syllable, right? So these different syllables here may actually, this, for example, could be two different words. But, if it's a word, again, I'll just use carpet as an example. This symbol might represent car, and this symbol might represent pet, right? You get the idea. One of the difficulties of this early writing, again, is that there were hundreds of characters, in fact, thousands at the very early stages of this writing system, and that meant that in order to be literate, you had to memorize every single character. So you can sort of call into question how literate Shang society might have been because it was so difficult to master the language. Again, notice here, this is some of the most ancient examples of Shang writing, and you see that there is definitely a physical resemblance between the symbol itself and the actual thing. And consider again, even though these symbols may seem crude, how long it would take to draw each one as opposed to how long it might take to write out a phonetic word. So another historical argumentation question. Scholars actually debate whether bronze was invented, or discovered rather, and the bronze industry was discovered in China independently from other empires like Sumeria. So in other words, there are some scholarly opinions that say that the reason why China had bronze industries was because they traded with Sumeria and got the bronze technology from Sumeria. On the other hand, there are other scholars who argue that the Chinese figured out how to work with bronze on their own, and they were very much isolated from Sumeria, so this could be a valid point. But again, there's no right or wrong answer to this question, and for that matter, it could be a little bit of both. Another very, very prominent material and very valuable at that material that was used by the Chinese was silk. Still is very, very valuable in China. And this was in high demand because it was imported and it was virtually impossible, at least at this period in history, to produce anywhere outside of China because the silkworms are indigenous to China. So again, this is something that was most popular among the upper classes within China, and even more so among the upper classes outside of China, because this was an imported good, and if you could afford Chinese silk, that meant that you were very wealthy. Okay, as far as Shang politics are concerned, much like some of the earliest empires throughout the world, the earliest Shang political system was quite decentralized. So in other words, you did not have this very all-powerful capital consistently that oversaw the rest of the entire empire, right? So throughout the Shang history, so throughout 600 years, give or take, you actually had 7 different capitals, right? So essentially this means that when a different king came into power, he could very well and easily at that move the capital from one city to another. We have one city, and it's located approximately where this arrow is pointing, called Ao, which is in present-day Henan province. And one of the things that's really interesting about Ao, as you can see here, is that there's some very well-preserved architectural artifacts, right? So here we're actually looking at Fu Hao's tomb. Fu Hao was actually concubine of the king who was named Wu Ding, and this was a tomb that that was built in the 13th century BCE. So a concubine, by the way, is like a mistress. She wasn't actually legally married to the king, and she was one of many wives. Okay, but we see, based on this tomb, that Fu Hao became very famous and powerful, even as a concubine, and this happened fairly frequently in Chinese history. There were some concubines, for example, that essentially ruled as queens at periods. So one of the reasons why this tomb is so unique is that it was never raided or looted, so it's very well preserved. You can see in this image that there were very valuable items. Some of these objects are made out of bronze. There are others, more difficult to see though, that are made out of jade. You also have weapons in this tomb. There were dogs that were buried alive along with Fu Hao, and 16 other human bodies were found. So essentially we see that not only was Fu Hao very important, but she was so important that she was buried with other people. And the idea, just like in ancient Egypt, was for those people to care for her in the afterlife. So what happened to the Shang dynasty? Well, it essentially collapses after time, and it collapses because there are other civilizations that were in modern-day China that existed outside of the Shang dynasty. So archaeology is still working on who these societies were, how large they were, how complex they were. Most records so far show that these societies were not quite as complex and organized as the Shang dynasty, but nonetheless, they had enough military power, and the Shang dynasty also became weak as time went on, that as they continuously attack the Shang dynasty, it collapses around 1000 BCE or so. And so what happens is that there's a ruler from the north. The ruler is named Wu, and essentially he marches into the capital of the Shang dynasty at the time. He kills the king, and then he founds the Zhou dynasty, which is the next dynasty we'll talk about. And the Zhou dynasty was even longer lasting, about 800 years or so. But actually, one could argue that the Zhou dynasty was weaker than the Shang, and we'll get there in a second. So why should we care about the Shang dynasty? So first off, if we see the Shang dynasty as the first Chinese dynasty, it sort of sets the precedent for all future dynasties. It shows us that, of course, this is sort of a hereditary monarchy, right, where, it's a series of families until a dynasty is conquered and then a new dynasty begins. Another thing that we start to discuss from the Shang dynasty and thereafter is this notion of the mandate of heaven. So think about this as similar to absolute monarchy in Europe. So in other words, the mandate of heaven was this idea that rulers were essentially given their power by God. And with that said, rulers could also get their power taken away from them by God, right? So if rulers were effective, this meant that they had the mandate of heaven, right? They had the mandate to rule because God chose them. But if they were not effective rulers and they were overthrown, this essentially proved that the king deserved to lose, right? That the king did not have the mandate of heaven, and therefore it was perfectly justifiable for a new dynasty to conquer and start ruling. Okay, so when the Shang dynasty collapses around 1000, to be more specific, 1046 BCE, then the Zhou dynasty takes its place. So again, King Wu founds the Zhou dynasty in 1046 BCE. Again, this is relatively gradual in the sense that the Shang dynasty had to be gradually conquered. Now you see in this map, this is essentially the height of the Zhou dynasty here. So again, it's mostly eastern China, areas that are still very populous today. Eventually, as time goes on, you're going to see that the Zhou dynasty is actually going to split in two. So what we actually see is that the Zhou dynasty is not particularly unified. The Western Zhou was in some ways the stronger period of the Zhou dynasty in the sense that it was a little bit more centralized and power was located much more in the western portions of the dynasty. Now, the Eastern Zhou essentially supersedes or becomes more militarily powerful than the Western Zhou around 771 BCE, and it continues until the collapse of the Zhou dynasty in 256 BCE. So this period is referred to as the period of warring states. One of the reasons why that is because, again, the government is very decentralized. Essentially, it follows like a feudal system in the sense that rule is very localized. Rule is by the wealthy and the people who own property. What you're going to see is that this warring states actually lent itself to the birth of one of the most influential leaders of China, past, present, and future, Confucius, right? And Confucius's doctrines you read about more or less the significance of political leadership, of the merit system, and the significance of family, and with that, for that matter, a patriarchal family, in many ways is an idea that's founded under Confucius. And I spelled Confucius wrong. That's embarrassing. There's no O at the end. Anyway, what we're going to see is that also during the Zhou dynasty, iron metallurgy is actually going to emerge and it's going to replace bronze in importance. And this happens around 200 BCE. All right, so it's essentially towards the end of the Zhou dynasty. And at the end of the Zhou dynasty, scholars sometimes refer to it as the Golden Age. Not literal gold, but honestly, it's the significance of the iron industry that makes the military quite powerful, of course, and it also makes China a more important trading empire because iron weapons are quite valuable. Now consider the fact that China is relatively isolated from empires farther to the west, so this is also a period when Southeast Asia and Oceania are growing, so these are also trade networks for China. And at the end, the Zhou dynasty is going to collapse around 256 BCE. The Qin dynasty is going to replace it around 221 BCE, and we'll talk in the next period about how significant the Qin dynasty was. Last question I want to ask you, and this is a really important AP level question, is why is it that period 1 ends in 600 BCE? What types of transitions exist that make that happen? So that's it for period 1. Subscribe if you like.